Hello and welcome to episode 2 of In Conversation. The series is aiming to provide information, advice and guidance for students who are thinking of entering higher education in this cycle. My name is Dr. Karl and Katherine, I'm the school's relationship manager. Today I'm joined by Dr. Catherine Lloyd-Clark, who's our assistant director for student recruitment and admissions. Hi Catherine, how are we doing?
Hi Karl, really well, thank you.
Fantastic. Catherine, we're going to start off by looking and reflecting back over the last 14 months. So we've had this notion of blended learning, and students listening to this today will have heard a lot about the word blended and have a little bit of queries on what does that actually mean. So I wonder whether we'd be able to start by getting an insight into, in reality, what blended learning has consisted of from our side.
Yes, so Karl, I think it's fair to say that universities even before the pandemic were really developing fast in terms of online and digital and virtual learning. So many universities have a virtual learning environment that they use to deliver elements of their content and to make, for example, lecture material available. But clearly during the pandemic, more elements of teaching and learning have had to be delivered through those frameworks than was previously the case. And even things like seminar groups where you have smaller group discussion, even things like laboratories, if you can believe it, have had to be delivered in a virtual context. Now, I think it's really important to emphasise, though, to Year 13s, that the support and the tools and the systems surrounding that blended learning would look very different in a university context to the way it's worked at school or college. We're talking about something very sophisticated compared to spending a lot of time, for example, on Google Classroom or on Teams. And there are specialist software packages, for example, that students have been able to engage with, and all sorts of really exciting resources that have been able to bring the curriculum very much to life. And of course, students who have been involved, for example, in clinical or laboratory courses have been prioritised by the government for coming back to campus. And so many of those disciplines have been able to have more periods of time doing face-to-face elements than perhaps other students who are studying subjects which don't have those face-to-face demands. It has been a challenging experience, and I don't want to whitewash that. But I think particularly in term 1, lots of students felt really engaged and excited with the blended learning package. And really, after Christmas, it wasn't so much that the academic experience was problematic for them. It was more that they were beginning to struggle with social isolation. And so we've worked really, really hard on support and well-being. Our student guild has been fantastic with some incredibly creative social activities. And really, I think it's been that social isolation more than the blended academic learning that's posed challenges as the pandemic's gone on. But let's hope for better things, Karl, and hope that we can really address that balance of face-to-face to digital as we move forward into September.
So talking about better things, we look ahead with optimism, and certainly within the UK, the vaccine programme is taking sort of good steps, and the government roadmap indicates that by the end of June, things should be reverting back to some kind of normality. So looking ahead to September then, what do we expect the teaching and learning experience for students to be like?
Well, Karl, we have to assume that there could be some element of restrictions, although we don't know exactly what that will look like. But I think the great thing is that we now have so much experience with delivering during the pandemic that if we do encounter any further difficulties, we will be able to put our best foot forward in meeting them. For example, our approach to delivering examinations and assessments has moved on such that we're able to do that in a really streamlined and accessible way, even if students do have to be doing elements of that remotely. But I very much hope that September will be much more of a normal return to campus than perhaps we experienced in the course of the last year. That would be very much the ideal. And of course, we don't know what social distancing requirements there will be, if any, at that point. But we've got all the attractions at Exeter of a wonderful outdoor campus with lots and lots of green space. And if we do need to have social activity going on with more of it outside, that is really something that is relatively straightforward for us. We're able to erect marquees, for example, to have social activities in. But I'm not trying to suggest that those measures will definitely be necessary in September, only that if they are, or if we have to revert to them, we've got really excellent experience now of how to maintain a really high quality student experience, even in a challenging context where we have to have elements of blended learning.
That's great. Now, there'll be some students listening to us now who will be weighing out their options and thinking, well, you know what, perhaps taking a gap year, deferring my entry for September 2022 may be a wise choice there. Can you reflect on what would be the advantages of taking a deferred gap year as opposed to starting in September?
Yeah, that's a really interesting theme, Karl, because actually one of the rather extraordinary aspects of our learning from last year was just how keen students were to continue with their plans and with their studies despite the pandemic. So actually, in autumn 2020, we didn't see a huge melt of numbers as students decided to defer or take gap years. Our numbers were really strong and students wanted to keep going. Now, I think there are students clearly within year 13, and I know this as I've got a year 13 daughter myself, who have decided that the world is just a little bit too uncertain at the moment for them to apply for university this year. And so clearly some students have already voted with their feet and decided to have a gap year to review the situation during that year and make their university applications afterwards. But if students are still wondering about deferral, I guess I would say keep your options open at this stage. We're only in May at the moment, and as you've said yourself, Karl, things are set pretty fair for the UK at the moment in terms of, the reduction of some of our social distancing and COVID measures, the vaccine programme rolling out to the 18 to 30 group really soon now, as far as the government information goes. We're preparing to be able to give second doses to students in their university destination without them having to travel home for those second doses. So, all of that should mean that the experience is hopefully steadier than it was for students last autumn. So I don't think there'll be a huge rush to deferral, and I think the sensible approach is to keep options open at the moment and to carry on with plans unless circumstances radically dictate something different.
That's great. Thank you, Catherine. Now, if we can turn to study abroad and industrial placements. Obviously, with study abroad, there's the implication of travel and going to different countries, etc. And we can see at present that there are severe travel restrictions in place. So there are questions there about how will that be managed and how will that play out for students who wish to get engaged in those options. And similarly with industrial placements, will they have the opportunities to be able to submerge themselves into real scenarios and businesses, etc. So I know this is a big question to ask, but how have we dealt with it so far would be, I guess, the first question to look at. And then the second phase of that would be, what do we expect it to be like for students in the coming years?
Yes, well, study abroad in particular, Karl, has been a really challenging area over the last year. when the pandemic first emerged, we had students that were in far-flung parts of the world that we needed to support with urgent return. But I think it's important to stress there that the university made it its top priority to support students returning to the UK. And, we knew where people were, we knew what we needed to do to support them getting back. And we were very much right behind them every step in the way in doing that. So that should provide some reassurance that in an emergency, the university, is right behind its students. Of course, for students who had been planning study abroad and were not able to travel, that was often quite disappointing. It's often an element of study that people really, really look forward to as a very transformational time in their lives. I know it was for me. I did a year abroad in the United States, and it set me on a totally different path with my studies. I discovered American history and went on to do my PhD in that area. So study abroad is an amazing transformational experience. We've had to get creative with it, Karl, and many of our study abroad partners have been offering digital experiences where it's not been possible for people to travel to them, and students have been able to make some friends, to have classmates, in that online space, even if they've not been able to travel. But of course, for year 13s who are starting in the autumn, in fact, we've got some time to play out before their own study abroad or work experience takes place. And we very much hope perhaps that vaccine programmes around the rest of the world will have gathered pace by then and will support the return to travel in the more conventional sense of study abroad. So hopefully for this year 13, there is plenty of hope that will be the case. In terms of industrial experience, many employers have been incredibly accommodating and have enabled people to engage digitally with the workplace. And of course, there's something very positive to say about that in terms of the advancement of people's skills in digital learning and digital working. So although it's been very disruptive for many students, the skill set that has gone with that is immensely valuable, I think.
That's great. Thank you, Katherine. My last question for the day is in relation to places at the university. So we know that universities have a finite number of places for courses, and certainly last year there was a prediction that we would receive less international students because of the restrictions and the pandemic. So we increased the number of home students that we took onto courses. Now, looking ahead to this cycle and the summer and September, do we envisage the same situation occurring again?
Well, Karl, I think the important thing to stress around student numbers is that the limits we have, the number of places we want to make available, are very much geared towards ensuring that everybody gets the best possible student experience. We don't want to take more students than we plan for if we can help it, because we really want to be able to deliver the right class sizes, the right campus experience, and of course to ensure that we have accommodation for everybody. So we have a very planned approach to our numbers. We're monitoring the international situation very carefully. There is perhaps a little bit more risk than there was last year in terms of international arrivals because of the red list countries that the government has set up. And we're a little bit uncertain at the moment as to how many students are going to have to go into quarantine and of course cope with the substantial costs of that, although the university is in principle offering some support for international students and quarantine costs subject to an application for that support. So we want to help with that if we possibly can. Last year, in fact, we were only a few hundred students short in terms of undergrad international from where we'd expected to be. Students were in many instances able to either arrive later on in the term or to study or start studying remotely. We don't quite know how that's going to work out at the moment for this autumn, but we're planning to be as flexible as the government rules will allow. And that should mean, hopefully, that as many students as possible who are currently planning to come to Exeter can do. And I think in terms of the home undergraduates, the UK undergrads, I would be relatively optimistic that the measures the government's put in place for teacher assessed grades this year will avoid the sort of challenges that we saw last year, where numbers did very much go up as a result of the 2 rounds of results days that we saw. Let's hope that things are steadier for this August, and I really would like to wish everyone who may be doing assessments or providing evidence for their teacher assessed grades at the moment the very best of luck with that whole process.
And that wraps up this episode. Thank you, Katherine, for your input and your wisdom. We'll be back next week, so thank you for listening, and see you next week.